Welcome back to the A4S Summit. I am really delighted to be introducing today's guest. The theme that we're focusing on today is around people and place, and it's great to have you with us, Mellody. Mellody Hobson is the CEO, co-CEO, and president of Ariel Investments, which is a Chicago-based investment management firm founded in 1983. And Mellody is involved in a huge number of additional activities. I won't do them all justice, Mellody, because you are involved in such an impressive amount of things, but maybe just to pick up one or two. So one of the areas you've spoken out a lot about is financial literacy, and maybe we'll be able to pick up on some of those themes, but also you're vice chair of the board of Starbucks, director of JP Morgan Chase, and previously chair of the board of DreamWorks Animation, and also a long-standing board member of Estee Lauder Company. So I can't think of many people better qualified to share reflections on the topic of today, particularly looking back at the experiences we've all had over the past year and the kind of impact that the pandemic has had on people and place, some of the other trends that we're facing in the world, and just to explore some of the changes, what that might mean for finance, and how collectively we can work together towards a just and inclusive world. So welcome to the A4S Summit.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be a part of the conversation, and I so much appreciate your focus on some of these topics.
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about them. I'd like to start thinking about the past year and looking at the kind of impact that the pandemic has had on lives and livelihoods of so many around the world, and of course is continuing to shape our lives. What have you learnt from 2020? Are there any experiences that have really made you think differently or provided real insight about yourself, about society, about business, that looking back a year ago you weren't really expecting?
There's so much in that question, so I'll try to hit the various aspects of my life and what I've learned. So I'll do the corporate side, the personal side, and see how that lines up. So I'll just do the corporate side first. I think there are a couple of remarkable things. I'm on the board of JP Morgan, as you mentioned, and I remember being in a meeting and Jamie Dimon saying, we all took the business continuity test and passed. I mean, who would have thought that we would be able to work like this in all corners of the world and be connected in a way where we truly are functioning and functioning at a very high level. I think that is something that has been remarkably just taken everyone by surprise, but also the fact that we've seen clearly a digital adoption happen in months that probably would have taken years, if not decades, where we've had a confluence of events lead to just rapid adoption in ways that perhaps I think no one ever expected, from Zoom to a whole host of other things. And so everything that was happening from a technological standpoint is accelerating at warp speed. And that has been something that has been fascinating to watch. The last thing I would say, I'd quote Warren Buffett. You know, Warren Buffett always says, champions adapt. And I think that's one of the things we've seen about our society. I think people are champions, and I think people and corporations have had to adapt very, very quickly. And that adapting has been, again, quite successful. On the personal side, I would say that two stories very quickly. One, early in the days of the pandemic, I was sort of lamenting about feeling trapped at home. And my husband looked at me, who's older than I am, and he said to me, you know, Mellody, have some perspective. During World War II, people lived in bunkers for 5 years. They didn't have news, they didn't have information, food was rationed. This is not bad. And, you know, really having that perspective shifted me dramatically to be very, very grateful for every single thing I have, roof over my head, food on the table, understanding those who do not, and really having great empathy and doing whatever I can and whatever we can as a society to make up for the shortfalls that literally hundreds of millions of people are feeling. And then last but not least, I had a situation where just through a course of events, I had to sit with my daughter on Zoom with school, and she's 7 years old. And if this hasn't changed our appreciation for teachers, I don't know what will. And really understanding all of the essential workers out there, all of the teachers who are out there who make our lives possible and who take care of our most precious asset, our children. I think they deserve a special place in heaven. And I think we can do more for the teachers in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't think there are many other parents who don't share that deeper appreciation, thinking of their own failures. In some cases, certainly, if I think of a lot of my friends, I'd really love to come back to a few of those points. But first, I'd like to talk through and get your perspective on one of the other really seismic shifts that I think we've seen over the past year. And it feels almost like the pandemic and the deepening that has had maybe that appreciation for others and that connection with humanity has potentially opened up a space in a way that other years might not. And that's, of course, George Floyd's profoundly shocking death and the global movement for racial justice, that particularly Black Lives Matter, that has really sparked. And the shift that we've then seen in terms of the conversation in the boardroom, and of course throughout society. It feels like we might finally be seeing real commitment to action, but I'd be really interested in your thoughts on the changes that we're seeing, reflections on the last year, and how we might take that forward. Well,
first, I always am very specific in saying George Floyd's murder. He was murdered. It wasn't just a death, it was a murder. We watched that murder, that 8 minutes, and I think it's 46 seconds uninterrupted of someone being killed. And that is horrifying and infuriating at the same time, and devastating. And I think that's for humanity, not just for people of color to watch. And I think it was also another awakening in America around civil rights and the injustices of our society. Another, because we've had them. And so I called this Civil Rights 3.0. If 1.0 was the emancipation of slaves during, President Lincoln's term, and 2.0 was the civil rights era in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, where we had the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. 3.0 is the fact that civil rights has now landed at the feet of corporate America in a way that has never been there before. And I think that is something that we have to acknowledge as being very, very different this time. And corporate America is dealing with things that they've never had to deal with before, from mental health issues to live shooter drills to racial inequality and what that injustice means for the broader society. And people are holding corporate America responsible, starting with the employees of the companies, first and foremost. Next, their customers have an opinion about how they run their business. And last but not least, because of the viral nature of our society, the broader society. And so what that means is talk is no longer enough. And as I've said, talk is cheap. It's now time for action. We've had a lot of words. Now it's time for elbow grease. And that elbow grease is around concrete actions and ultimately concrete incentives to make sure corporations are more diverse and inclusive. And I start with incentives because I think in corporate America, we are used to incentives and you get what you incent. And if corporations really mean it when they say diversity and inclusion is mission critical, and I do believe it is, I do believe that if you're not a 21st century company that is chasing diversity, you are committing corporate suicide. If it is as crucial as people say they are, the highest levels of the organization, from the board to the CEO, have to be held accountable. Thinking of your own experiences, maybe starting with some of the boards that you sit on, and are there any responses either historically, because I think a few years back Starbucks
confronted some of these issues head on, but also, over the past year, are there any examples that you would like to call out where you think you really are seeing some of those tangible responses that others should be acting on now?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I wouldn't call out any names, but I would say just generally the attitude is one of there's been a tremendous outreach to me, and I know people like me, by white CEOs who want to crack the code on this issue, who recognize that that racial inequity and racial problems are bad for business. That's everything from where we saw civil unrest in the streets, which is very much tied to economic inequality in our country, to also just the conversations that they need to have with their own people to address these issues. So I think that there is a reckoning of sorts occurring, and leadership understands the need to act. And I think that is fundamentally different than what we've seen before. Before it was government that had the reckoning, that had to act with laws and policies and the like. And now again, it's corporations that are in the hot seat.
If you were to, in those conversations that you have with CEOs and others, what are the actions that you're saying to them that they should be taking? If you look at 1 year from now, where do they really need to be?
We talk about the 3 Ps. Well, I'll start off with this sense that I think math has no opinion. So you want to get at the math, you want to get at the numbers. And my firm, along with Russell Reynolds and Deloitte, sponsors a conference every year called the Black Corporate Directors Conference that brings together Fortune 500 Black directors. We also added in Latinx directors a few years ago in the spirit of diversity and inclusion. And we talk about bringing the civil rights agenda in the boardroom as a fiduciary, because we think that is a part of our fiduciary responsibility to make the company a better company for its shareholders. And ultimately, we focused on the 3 Ps: people, purchasing, and philanthropy. We say if it matters, it counts, so start counting. At the top of the organization to the bottom, look at people by ethnicity. No putting them all together in some multicultural umbrella of gender and race. By ethnicity, if you count that way, you can see where you have underrepresentation and fix it. And you need targets. And I think the targets in America should be directly correlated to the demographics of our broader society. It makes it very easy. Secondly, we talk about purchasing and the fact that supplier diversity is a last century concept. And we want to push companies to think about business diversity. When you think about your vendors across all areas of corporate spend, are you inclusive? And more importantly, in the biggest areas of spend, professional services, financial services, technology, do you include diverse vendors? Because to the extent that all of us can compete, again, we'll have a better society. And then last but not least, we talk about philanthropy. And there we think, I'm worried that could be the tail that's wagging the dog. There's a lot of virtue signaling going on right now where people want to show that they're down with the cause. And one thing I think is great is that you've had a lot of civil rights institutions get a sudden influx of cash that I think will help them on their mission. And that's critically important. But you can't fix your house from without. You have to fix it from within. And so I would say to corporate leaders, while that donation is great, your internal dynamics are more important ultimately to the success, first and foremost, of our society, but ultimately to your business.
And coming back to that first point, so the counting and the setting of targets, that's something that we see through all of the areas we work in, and really embedding that into the heart of decisions, and it drives change. But I know that some people can set an ambitious target, or what feels like an ambitious target. Are there some things that you've seen organizations do successfully that can really drive the kind of transformation that is really required to make sure that we are mirroring wider society in terms of diversity across the board within an organization?
Tying the targets to the compensation of the leaders. That's the thing that ultimately moves the needle. Again, you get what you incent. And if it is going to affect someone in their pocketbook, suddenly it's important to them. And it's to meaningfully count. It can't be marginal or, not material to the possibilities for that person's success, if it is as important as you say it is. And so when you tie those goals to compensation, you start to see numbers move at the end of the day.
And from an investor perspective, what would you like to see investors doing, and how can investors be really integrating into their own investment decisions?
What I always say is use your power for good. As shareholders, we have enormous power. We vote proxies, and our no vote can be very, very problematic for a corporation. And so understanding that we have a right to ask questions about these issues, and it's not only just a right, we should be asking these questions, because at the end of the day, they could affect the outcome of our investment as it relates to those for whom we invest. And so, for example, a board not being diverse, that should be unacceptable. It should be something that shareholders say, we want to see diversity on this board. Now, I think you're going to see a rash of additions to boards over the next year in terms of filling out the diversity of the board. I think that's a really good thing and a really good outcome, and will lead to better outcomes for the company and holding it accountable. But that's just like a simple, easy one. I mean, that's like anyone can see that before you even ask about other diversity stats or maybe making those stats public and the like. So I think that as investors, we have enormous sway over outcomes around these issues. And I would only encourage investors to take up the mantle, because it's ultimately in their best interest. Again, poor race relations is bad for business, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of the connecting that and some of the actions and issues that you would like to see and that we need to see when it comes to race and diversity, the pandemic has also had a huge impact in terms of the workplace more broadly. And you touched on some of that digital transformation earlier. Can you say a little bit more about that shift and the shift that we're seeing in the workplace, what some of the consequences of that shift might be, what you think that is going to stick with us, and what the consequences might be? I think potentially some good, some bad.
I mean, this one is definitely a double-edged sword. So, and who knows how it's all going to sort out. Anyone who states that with any certainty, I mean, they're just guessing. We don't know. Do we believe that this prolonged period of working from home in many white-collar jobs is going to lead to a more flexible work schedule for some percentage of teammates and employees? I would say yes. A large percentage, I don't think so, but I think there will be a lot more flexibility. And I think a bunch of companies will also realize they have more real estate than they need, and they'll rethink their real estate footprint. I also think the one thing about Zoom and working in this way is that you learn very quickly who's essential and who you forgot you even work with. And if you're one of those people that people have forgotten that they work with, I worry you might not have a job unless you show up in a different way. And so people who ghost on Zoom, I'm like, what are you thinking? Where you're just, a black screen and you're having a meeting. I'm like, you have to show up in a meeting. So why aren't you showing up in this? Unless your Wi-Fi is down, I would strongly suggest your face appear on the screen. So I think that there are those issues that there will be probably some downsizing in the workforce. We've already seen that. But also I think that how we work may change, excuse me, in a, I don't want to say meaningful, excuse me, but certainly on the margin, I think we're going to see some changes. I also think, flying around the world for one meeting, I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I just don't think it'll happen. I think the early meetings of a sales process will probably be on Zoom until you're in that closing phase. So I think there are some things like that, that the travel will be different than it has been in the past. But again, I'm assuming some things based upon the fact that we haven't been doing this for a few weeks. It's going to be probably a year, and some things will really start to settle in. Lastly, I would say that I think that what has been good is there is some efficiency in terms of traveling to work and time spent commuting and things like that. It's undeniable. On the flip side, when does the innovation start to really wane? Because you're not just having those moments of innovation around the water cooler or in the hallway. You have to actually set up a meeting on Zoom to discuss things. And so are those gee whiz moments happening in those moments that you just don't expect? So those are trade-offs, and we'll just see how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of some of those areas where there might be deeper consequences that the CEOs and other business leaders need to be thinking about, certainly one thing that I think we've seen is a bit of a maybe a reaction initially, that everyone was thinking, oh, this is fantastic, everyone should be working from home, and then a little bit of pulling back from that, recognizing that not everyone's home situation is one where you can work effectively. Some people, more than others, might really need that office environment to be able to work effectively, whether it is through the social contact with others, or because they just don't have the right setup at home, and particularly with different generations of employees coming through the organization. So how can organizations and business leaders really grapple with some of those trade-offs? It can seem very efficient and very effective, but in the long run, maybe not so.
I think it'll be certain types of jobs. You'll ask yourself, does this person need to be in the office? And if they don't, they may not be required to be there. I think you're not going to run the place and be working from home. That's just not going to happen. I also think that we have to be realistic about the fact that lots of people like to go to work. They like to wake up and put on a suit and walk into an office, and they feel not only productive, but they feel stimulated by other people in person. I'm one of those people. Yes, there are a lot of benefits to having lunch with my 7-year-old every day. But at the same time, I can tell you, I crave the intellectual stimulation of my colleagues in an office setting. And so I don't think it's so black and white that, everyone's doing the Snoopy happy dance because they're at home working. And of course, everyone isn't. There are plenty of people that have to be out every day. And there are also, certain environments where you just have to have a person manning the fort. So, I think that as I said, the jury's out, but I don't, in any way believe that everyone, if you just said it's your choice, I don't think a vast majority of my colleagues would choose working from home. Some would. There's no question. And we'll hope to have the opportunity for those who can to be able to do that. But I think a large number of my colleagues would want to be in the office together because we actually enjoy each other and have fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe there'll end up being some kind of balance between the two. But definitely the leap in technology that you mentioned earlier has made it possible to have that kind of choice. One of the other things you touched on there was around travel. And of course, one of the themes that we've been looking at through our work is also some of the environmental crises we face. Now, of course, those climate change and other social crises tend to hit people of colour the hardest. The pandemic has given ample evidence of that, but also you see similar statistics starting to emerge when it comes to climate change, as well as disproportionately impacting women, low-income communities. When it comes to some of these issues, so around the environment, around gender, race, they're very different issues, but sometimes you do see those connections. Do you think that there are solutions that we might be able to find in the way that we tackle one issue that we can transfer across and help to tackle a whole set of some of these very complex interconnected issues? And how can finance play a role in really finding those connections, responding and dealing with them, rather than picking them off one by one, recognizing that there is that interdependence and that you need a holistic approach in response?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a holistic approach that I can say for the entire financial services industry. But what I can say is, again, having institutions understand the power that they have to affect change inside of corporations is significant. And really owning that power, I think, is where society is going to hold us accountable, because society knows that we have that power. And so that power means making sure that there are sensible policies around the environment and around climate, and that corporations are following the laws of the land in that regard, and not cutting corners in ways that lead to bad outcomes. There's no question that the environmental and climate change issues that are occurring in our world, yes, they are affecting all of us, from flora and fauna and the like becoming extinct, and the oceans and the issues that are happening there. But there's also a undeniable truth that these issues disproportionately affect poor people in terms of the air quality of communities with, factories, in terms of the water purity, all of these things. It is inarguable. And here's again, we're back to the same point. All of us now walk around with phones in our pockets with cameras, and many, many people can document these things. And if they are at the hand of a corporation, again, that's going to augment the risk for that business and ultimately lead to poorer outcomes for its shareholders. And so understanding that is critically important. I have a friend who once said to me, and it's a powerful statement, it's very expensive to be poor. But from an actual financial standpoint, that is true, the interest rates and the like that are charged, but it's also true from a perspective of health and the lower life expectancies of individuals who come from poorer communities. And we have to take responsibility for that as corporate citizens and understand we have a role in those outcomes. And that was my point about these societal ills are at the feet of corporate America in a way that they have not been before. And the accountability is at the feet of corporate America in a way that has not been before, again, because of the viral nature of our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to corporate America and thinking of the boards that you sit on or your broader experience, there are a lot of different issues that boards are having to handle at the moment, and they are all urgent. So what's your advice to your fellow board members and others to find ways to get on top of this whole set of very diverse issues with the kind of urgency that they demand?
So I hope you will indulge me in this comment when I say it. It is not to trivialize any issue, but everything that is urgent is not important. A lot of you can drink from a fire hose in business and in life as you try to juggle too many things, perhaps. I think getting a few things right could be transformative, not only for the broader society, but for corporations, both collectively and individually. And understanding what those few things are, I think is very, very important. And you talked about climate and the environment. That's one of them. Just in terms of the long haul and the bigger picture in terms of our ability to live on this planet, that is not an insignificant issue. But also when you think about just how you treat people, both outside of your organization, inside of your organization, understanding your constituents, that is something that is also important. And how you treat people goes into a lot of buckets. That's what kind of benefits do they get? What kind of pay equity do they have? What kind of opportunity do they have? Is it different based upon their race or gender or sexual orientation? That's a bucket. And so again, if you try to boil the ocean, you get overwhelmed. And so how do you do this? You have to take them in broad strokes to understand in this bucket of how we treat people, what's in that bucket? In this bucket of how we treat our environment, what's in that bucket? Because otherwise it's just fire drills every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking of some of those fire drills, because there are, as you say, in each of those buckets, there's some pretty burning issues that need to be dealt with in the context of the economy, which is also suffering a real hitting at the moment. And we know that with that's something that is not going to go quickly. There's a lot of debt building up in many economies around the world. And at the same time, we really need to try and find a way to achieve a sustainable recovery and equitable recovery. Thinking both from the kind of actions you would like to see from government as well as business, can you say a little bit about what you think is needed to achieve that sustainable, equitable recovery?
So first and foremost, there is an immediate, and I said everything that is urgent is not important. This is urgent and important. In America, we need stimulus fast. People are hungry. They are, their housing is in question because we have moratoriums on evictions going away. We have unemployment insurance that is running out. We have food lines that we've never ever seen in our modern day. Food lines that haven't been like this since my vision of images that I've seen and pictures of the Great Depression, although those weren't cars lined up for miles. We have 50 million Americans right now who are food insecure. 12 million of those are children who are worried about food on a day-to-day basis. This is not right in a country with the wealth that we have per capita versus the rest of the world. It is just a travesty. And we desperately, desperately, desperately need our Congress to act immediately. They did a great job this summer putting money in the hands of people who needed it and giving them a lifeline. That lifeline has run out, and if we're going to dig a much deeper hole if we don't help and come to the rescue right away. We learned these lessons during the Great Depression. And I give FDR a lot of credit. I've been looking back and reading about what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did during that period. The safety nets of America were put in place during that period. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, minimum wage went up to $5 an hour. A lot of things happened during that time. And government worked with business. The robber barons, Carnegie, Ford, DuPont, all of those individuals came together with government to try to solve for the giant economic problem that the country and ultimately the world was facing. We need that kind of cooperation right now, but it has to start with stimulus.
Absolutely. And if you do get that kind of response, if you do see that stimulus injection, that's part of the immediate response. If you look to the foundation that we need to lay then in terms of the longer term and that longer term recovery, what would you like to see happening there?
In terms of a longer term recovery, I think we need to put into place the long talked about infrastructure bill that has eluded several administrations, but ultimately is in the best interest again of society. Not only because our roads and bridges and foundation is crumbling, but more importantly, again, it is a shot in the arm in terms of jobs and employment. And again, if I go back to the Great Depression, Central Park was built during that period as a jobs and works program. Literally, it was created as an endeavor to create opportunity for people to get a paycheck that ultimately has created, obviously, a beautiful park for the world to see. I think we have to be creative in that way, spend wisely. I'm not talking about drunken sailor spending. I'm talking about spending in ways that ultimately lifts up the nation, both figuratively and literally. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Money is very cheap right now in terms of rates. And so if you were ever going to, have to raise government bonds, et cetera, for these programs, this would be the time to do it. But then also you'll have the need for employment in that regard. I think there are some other social programs that need to be looked at. We have to look at small businesses in this country and figure out what we can do to help restore them, because so many small businesses have taken it on the chin. They ultimately employ a lot of people. And so we have to think about small business initiatives and what can be done to give them their sea legs again. And the last one for me is student debt. If we can find a solution for student debt in America, I think it gives young people the economic freedom to go and start businesses and do some of the things that they would do that they are currently incapable of doing because the amount of debt that is shackled around their ankles. And I'm not talking about just free and forgive, etc., but creating incentives, opportunities for individuals. And we've seen some of that before. It just hasn't quite been executed as well as I would hope. Like if you become a public servant, how is your debt forgiven? If you're a fireman or a teacher, I talked about teachers earlier. Some of that has been tried before. I think we could be much more intentional and robust right now, especially during a time when we're facing these unemployment numbers. When you're in full employment, it's hard to do some of these things. But when you see unemployment numbers go up like we've seen, and it's going down aggressively and will go down in a post-vaccine environment and a post-vaccine economy. But what can we do to spark and make sure that we can slingshot out of this period as opposed to limp out of it?
Yeah. And is that another area that you can see us connecting so that it can be a recovery that does create jobs, that deals with some of these the other issues that you've been touching on, whether it might be creating the kind of infrastructure that we need for the future in a way that is also tackles climate, and so that brings the green in there too?
I think there's a tremendous opportunity for that, and we're seeing it. I mean, regulations around building in this country are changing. So many things are changing. Emissions on cars. I mean, we could just go on and on. And the question is, how do you capture that? Some companies have done it. When you have China saying they're going to be all electric vehicles at some point, the world is changing. And the question is, when will, America put that kind of stake in the ground, even though there's a lot that we can see, a lot of changes and a lot is moving in that direction. But there is a lot of opportunity to capture this moment and the accelerating nature of some of the changes that are occurring. I talked about that acceleration from a technological standpoint. Now can you see this acceleration as it relates to some of the other areas, especially as you are already suggesting, the environment?
Yeah. So we're nearly out of time, Mellody. I could carry on firing questions at you, I think, for a long time, because I think there's so many different areas that we could be covering. I would like to finish with just two questions, if I may. And the first one is, if there's one ask that you would have, we've covered a really broad range of topics during the discussion, but if there's one ask that you would like to really make to the audience, what is that ask? What's that action that you would really like to see them take?
I would say to the audience that do or do not, there is no try, quoting Yoda, and especially as it relates to issues of race and diversity and inclusion. I think there are a lot of people out there who want credit for trying. And it reminds me of when I was in second grade and my teacher would give me partial credit for showing my math work, even if I got the wrong answer. Corporate America wants partial credit, but they are not landing on the right answer. And this is the only area in corporate life where you can fail consistently, or let me put it this way, not make much progress and still keep your job. Everything else, if we don't deliver earnings, if we don't deliver that product launch date, if we don't deliver those profit margins, we lose our job. And so here I would really suggest that we get very, very intentional and become very clear about our goals and what success means when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and not just talk about it.
Fantastic. And final question is, what gives you optimism? What makes you hopeful for the future, and that we will tackle some of these challenges and we will see action?
I'm always hopeful because I believe in people. I have a lot of hope and faith when it comes to humanity. Yes, there are times when I'm terribly and bitterly disappointed, but for the most part, the world, the story of the world is one of progress and innovation. And yes, I remember Barack Obama saying that sometimes we have to move backwards to move forwards. And maybe in recent times we've seen that. But I do believe that I am one of those people who always says, in the worst of times, what is the universe trying to teach me? And if we can learn from the universe during these difficult times, we can come out better and stronger and faster. And so I'm always hopeful that even in very, very, very bad times, and certainly we have seen them, death, despair, hunger, pain, and anguish, I know that it is alive and well in many, many corners of our society. And I don't in any way suggest that it is not very real. But even there, that is when some of the biggest breakthroughs in the world have occurred. And so can we use this as a time to tap in to this moment to have breakthroughs around climate, around being inclusive, around diversity, around economic opportunity and equality? If we can lean on this moment and have those breakthroughs, we'll be better for all the pain. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we'll look back on this period and say, it was difficult, but boy, was there a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mellody. It has been really inspiring speaking to you today. And I think that everyone who's been listening to today's session will take away, I hope, some of the inspiration that I've had, but also some of those really practical actions, and definitely something that we are going to be following up with everyone to see whatever we can do as part of that, leaning in and really pushing for change. So thank you very much, Mellody.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for engaging in these very important topics.
Great. Thank you very much.